So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending where in the world you're all joining us from. My name is Sabina Dewan, and I'm the founder and executive director of the JustJobs network. JustJobs is a global research organization that seeks to answer one of the most critical questions of our time. How do we create quality jobs, adaptive workforces, and resilient economies in these very tumultuous times? Several forces are upending the way that you and I live and work, ranging from the pandemic to climate change to technological shifts. And now we see that the global economy is being rocked by all kinds of trade shocks. And I find myself wondering how we got here. So in the 1980s and 1990s and the first decade or so of this century, we saw a systematic dismantling of tariff and non-tariff barriers that drove growth in global trade by about 4 to 5% annually. This was also the time when there was a restructuring of economic activity from integrated and centralized supply chains to fragmented and distributed ones. We saw the rise of production and exports in many developing countries from, Asia to Africa. And this was also the period when BRICS expanded to account for over 1/4 of world GDP, gross domestic product, by 2023. Most notably, there was also the rise of China to a position of dominance in strategic and frontier manufacturing chains. But recent years have seen a turning point, and in the post-COVID period, we saw a contraction in merchandise trade. Now there's more discussion of reshoring and nearshoring, new tariff and non-tariff regimes, most notably in the United States and the European Union, including things like industrial policies and sustainability requirements. These are all coming together to really reshape the global trading landscape and global value chains with cascading effects across the globe. These trade shocks are both the result of and are also fueling geopolitical tensions. And all of this has very serious implications for employment, especially in the global south, where many countries have large and growing youth populations and a labor surplus. So, what we want to do in today's webinar is really to unpack all of this past, present, and to have a view to how are these things unfolding to the future, right? And particularly sort of understanding the landscape and then kind of going a little bit deeper into the impacts of all of this on work and workers across the globe. It is my real pleasure today to welcome a really fantastic set of speakers to help us sort of understand the current landscape, to understand its implications for today and tomorrow. I will introduce all four of our speakers right now, and then we'll engage in a conversation. So I'm not going to interrupt the flow of the conversation later on with introductions, because I'll do that right now, and then we'll all know each other. We have, as one of our panelists today, we have Mr. Ed Gresser, who is the former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Trade Policy and Economics from 2015 to 2021. Currently, Ed is Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute. We also have with us Mr. Henrik Isakson, who is Director of Trade Policy at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. We have Ms. Liang, who is the Peter C. and Bonnie S. Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. And last but not least, we have Ms. Ranja Sengupta. Ranja Sengupta is Senior Economist. She is the head of the India office and coordinator of the trade program at the Third World Network. So a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us from different parts of the world and finding time during your busy schedules. So let's just jump right in. Ed, let me start with you. I want to start with kind of a broad question so you can lay out the current landscape for us. How would you assess the current landscape and the trade policies implemented under the Trump administration, their immediate impacts, the legal challenges the administration is facing in this area, and the potential consequences for the wider world, especially developing countries? So let's just jump right into it. Ed, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sabina, for inviting me. It's great to be here with JustJobs Network. And it's a very pressing question that lots of people are, learning about and asking themselves day by day. I guess what I'll do is say a couple of things about what actually has the administration done, um, what is the reaction to it within the United States so far, and what can we see so far in terms of its impacts, in particular for employment, with a view to some of the developing countries and and here at home. So the administration has come in, having promised a large increase in U.S. tariffs. It inherited a tariff rate on average in 2024 about 2.4%. That includes a very high tariff on a lot of Chinese goods. So if you take that, it's about 1.5%. They have put in a number of decrees, two or perhaps three or four, depending on how you count them, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and four or five under a different law called Section 232, which is a national security law. Those have lifted U.S. tariff rates now to about 18 to 20%, changes kind of week by week. No one really knows quite for sure. But that places the U.S. Among the highest tariff countries in the world, in a kind of tier with Solomon Islands, with Bermuda, with Chad, essentially small island countries and least developed states that have trouble running regular tax bureaucracies. India is among big economies, one of the highest tariff rates, 12%. So we're considerably above that for now. That has come in sequentially over time. We're beginning to get data on the effects, and we'll come to that in a minute. But a couple of things beneath this. One, there always has been during the period of liberalization, as you were mentioning, a group, a kind of dissenting current in the United States among steel industry and textile industry, among industrial labor unions, among some kind of academic left organizations, and it steadily represented 30 to 40% of the public, and that group more or less is now running U.S. trade policy and experimenting with their ideas. For the public as a whole, actually, I should say one more thing. One of the very strong features of the Trump administration is a dislike of multilateralism and international rules, and a sense that these have worked to the disadvantage of the United States. We, as the largest economy and biggest importer, should in some way be able to impose our will on the world, and they're quite intent on trying to do that and seeing whether that's really a correct assumption or not. Two domestic reactions. One, among the public in general, this is quite unpopular. There are a lot of major media polls looking at what do people think of an increase in tariff rates. Typically about 60 to 63 or 4% say they don't like it. About 30 to 35% say they do like it. So there's a fairly, not a tiny or very small base, but definitely a minority faction of the public is enthusiastic about this. It is also legally pretty fragile. The administration, rather than asking Congress to pass a tariff law, has instead used a series of executive orders and essentially decrees that we face an international emergency because of the tariff or the trade imbalance. We face national security threats, and some of these are quite far-fetched. Most recently, the administration has used a national security justification for tariffs on kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanity chests. So they're stretching these laws pretty far. About half of this has been challenged in courts. And so far, the administration has been losing this. So it is highly possible in the next few months, all of the tariffs under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act may be canceled. But they are trying hard to find alternatives to it. So this is a long-term thing for the administration, not something that's going to go away in a few months, I think. In terms of impacts at home and abroad, um, the system the administration is trying to create is unlike other tariff systems in that it applies very different rates to different countries. And this will probably have a big impact on the employment effects and the growth patterns in countries that are reliant on the US as a market. As an example, India has, they started out with a 25% tariff. It is for now 50%. Bangladesh is 20%. Australia is 10%. European Union 15%. Cambodia 20%. Laos 40%. Argentina 10%. So there's a huge variety of different rates. And added into the very frequent changes that is making very confusing for US businesses and is probably going to have pretty visible impact in some parts of the world. If you look at the kind of employment questions for countries of various sorts, India, export to the US is about $80 billion. That's quite a lot. There's a lot of food products, a lot of jewelry. On the other hand, the Indian economy is $3 trillion. So 80% is 2% of Indian GDP. Mexico exports to the US 27% of GDP. El Salvador, Honduras, 10 to 15%. So the degree of macro level damage that this can do overseas will vary greatly from one country to the next. India and China have had the highest US tariff rates, but also are relatively less dependent on the US. Some of the Central American countries are at the kind of the low ebb of 10%, but any damage to them is systemically a big problem for their economies. Probably the countries where workers and national economies are most at risk are those that are most reliant on preference and FTA relationships with the United States. I would point out two or three in particular. We have had for about 25 years special tariff benefits for most countries in Africa and for Haiti. These are designed for least developed countries and are attempts to get them, to help them to develop by attracting light industry investment, especially in textiles and apparel. Both of these programs will be terminated as of tomorrow. And the government of Lesotho has already declared a national disaster and expects the garment industry there to basically fall apart in these next few weeks or months. That will put 12 to 15,000 young women out of work in a kind of small landlocked country where there aren't really a lot of alternatives. Haiti, kind of very close to US, sort of similar situation. Does not have a government that's capable of imposing a kind of emergency situation and providing help. They sell lots of T-shirts to the United States. That's really the one part of the Haitian economy that's healthy and working, and it too may fall apart. So the impact is yet to be felt, but in some places, and in some particularly vulnerable places, it may be very severe. And in other places, it may, the trade coverage may be high, but the impact will be cushioned in the case of India by very large size of the Indian domestic economy and the export, diversification India has done, including with the EU. Finally, a look at one very kind of interesting and I think for an economist kind of surprising outcome in the United States, which is that the administration has justified all of this on the basis that U.S. manufacturing sector has been hurt by liberal trade and by global rules. A higher tariff system will protect it from overseas competition, and should expect once these tariffs are in place and stable, manufacturing will grow in the United States. So far, that has not happened at all. last year in the U.S., Commerce Department measures or tries to measure manufacturing share of GDP. It was 9.8% last year. It's now about 9.4%. So it's gone pretty noticeably down rather than up. And just as a kind of anecdotal explanation of how this is working, the Commerce Department's political side has received a lot of petitions from metal using manufacturers in the United States who are deeply distressed by the very 50% tariff the administration has put on steel and aluminum and copper. One example is an organization called the National Aerosol Association. These are people who make canisters for whipped cream and perfume spritzers and so forth. And what their petition says is the producers and fillers of metal aerosol packages in the U.S. face increased prices for key inputs as a result of the Section 232 tariffs, as tin plate steel, laminate steel, aluminum, and empty aerosol containers are all subject to the tariffs. As a result, these U.S. industries currently operate at a material disadvantage compared to foreign producers of empty and filled metal aerosol products, none of which face increased prices associated with Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. So in this case, the administration's tariff system is kind of depressing U.S. manufacturing and encouraging imports from other countries. They have tried to respond to this in a kind of comical way by declaring that condensed milk and cream and perfume and windshield de-icing fluid and things like that are now going to be considered steel and aluminum derivative products. So basically, like milk is made out of metal, and that anyone who's buying a can of whipped cream has to figure out what's the value of the metal in the can and try and pay a tax on it. So up to now, we've not seen actually a big drop in imports, nor have we seen a jump in U.S. manufacturing. And even with India, despite the very high tariff, we were running about $2 billion more in imports this year than we were last year. I doubt that's going to last, but it is an indication that the expectation of the administration that this is going to reshape the U.S. economy may be correct, but it's not reshaping in the way they thought it would. It is kind of depressing and contracting some parts of the manufacturing sector while probably inflating others. So we have not had an experiment like this before. The last large tariff increase in the U.S. was in 1930, and this is probably the biggest tariff increase the U.S. has ever had. If you measure from the original 2.4% to the current 18 or 20%. So there are a lot of surprises ahead, including in the United States. But there's some things that are probably pretty predictable. And I think to the extent there are predictable things, the countries that are least resilient, lowest income, most reliant on the U.S. are likely to get pretty badly damaged by this in these coming months.
Thanks so much, Ed. I have several follow-up questions, but I also want to bring in the voices of our other panelists, and then we'll do a second round where I want to come back to some of the things you've raised. For all those listening in, if you don't know this already, Ed has this really amazing newsletter that's called the Trade Fact of the Week that he's been doing for many, many years, and it's the most creative and informative newsletters in trade out there. It is always has a touch of humor to it, and kind of makes you really scratch your head about what are the people that are raising these tariffs and that are trying to navigate this landscape. Sometimes the ridiculousness of it all. I don't know if that's how you would characterize it, Ed, but it really is a great newsletter. I should let you describe it as well.
Thank you. Well, I should say as an introduction to that, it is free. There's no solicitations, and anyone who wants to subscribe, you can send us a note or you can sign up via our website. Basically, the service is an attempt to provide high quality, research from primary sources and good use of data, but in an accessible way that someone who isn't a WTO scholar or a tariff economist can understand, see why this might be relevant to them. Like, why is it or how is it that the U.S. is charging higher tariff rates on women's underwear than men's? Or what does it mean for the U.S. to be involved in a WTO case, and what does what does the outcome of one mean? So we try to make it understandable and interesting, and it is often kind of comical. Like, I had not thought the U.S. government in my lifetime would be saying that milk is made out of metal, but yes, yet here we are. That is what they're saying. And it's sad and it's damaging, but it's also it's something that's appropriate to laugh at.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Ed. Henrik, I'd like to come to you next. And, we heard from Ed, as the United States is sort of recalibrating, often with very unintended consequences, its trade and industrial policies, Europe is also navigating these major shifts, right? It's renegotiating terms with the US, it's introducing new sustainability and supply chain rules. It's recalibrating the Green Deal in ways that will reshape which industries and workers are positioned to trade with Europe in the future. And all of this comes against the backdrop of various kinds of trade negotiations with partners in the global south, including India. So I wanted to kind of turn to you and ask you to talk about this. How is the EU positioning itself within this current trading landscape and the changes that are taking place in the trading regimes? Over to you, Henrik. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. First of all, I'm happy that Ed was the first speaker so that I didn't have to do what I spend most of my time doing this year, which is explain what the Americans are doing and why they're doing it, because that's what I spent most of my time doing this year. But today I could actually talk more about what we're doing in Europe. So I'm not an official representative of the European Commission or for the Swedish government for that matter, although my views very often do align with the official positions, but certainly not always. I'm representative of the Swedish Confederation of Enterprise, which is the main business organization in Sweden. So just saying that so you see where my views are coming from. And so as for your question, I interpret the question as basically how are we navigating in the present situation? And then I need to start with what we actually would want in an ideal world, and that is free and open trade. We are traditional free traders. We like borders to come down. We don't only like exports, we like imports as well. We don't forget services. We know that much of trade is in services, not just in goods. We like the WTO and we support it. We want it to thrive. We also like FTAs, free trade agreements, when the WTO can't reach all the way. And these views are supported by, basically, they're supported by our companies. There are really no protectionist sentiments in Sweden. Sweden is a very free trade oriented country. So most business people would agree with the notion that if a business cannot compete, they should go bankrupt. They should not be shielded by tariffs. That's unlike the situation in many other countries, I know that. But that's the situation in Sweden and to a lesser degree, but in many other countries in Europe as well. It's also supported by most people. I mean, Sweden is different. We need to realize that. And if you just say the word free trade to an average Swede, they don't know really what it means, but they think it has a nice connotation. They like the sound of it. So we are free traders. Having said that, the world has changed a lot during the last 10 years, and they changed for better and worse even before Trump came into the picture. The first major shift that came maybe 10 years ago was that sustainability suddenly became the big thing in trade in Europe. And the traditional trade issues of market access and so on kind of became a secondary thing. And that created mostly opportunities, but of course also problems for European firms. Problems in the sense that sustainability can cost money. You need to make new investments. You might need to hire new people. You might need to reorganize your value chains and your production techniques and so on and so on. But many of those changes have already happened. to a large degree in Sweden and to many other countries because we are a front runner in this, but it has to a large degree happen in many other European countries as well. But sustainability is two things. It's green sustainability and social sustainability. And green sustainability is easier for us to deal with because much of that has to do with coming up with new technologies, spreading it through the world to contribute to decarbonization. And that is basically all of the companies that I represent would say that this is mostly an opportunity. This is something with the quicker the green transition takes place in Europe, the better it is for our businesses. The social dimension is, of course, a bit different, but I would say it's more of an ethical issue then. There are no clear, direct profit reasons to engage in it, but there are ethical reasons to do it. Because I argue that the reason that Swedish businesses in general and European businesses are in favor of sustainability is both for profits and people. Profits because this is something that will be profitable. But the people aspect is basically that I think the businesses are owned by people, the CEOs are people, the board of directors are people, the employees are people, the customers are people, and people in general in Europe are very supportive of the green transition. Still, there is a backlash for sure, and not everyone is happy. But the kind of sentiment that we see in America is not the same in Europe, not at all. So because of that, sustainability is still high on the agenda in Europe for our businesses. The second more recent change when it comes to what trade policy needs to take into account is the security dimension. And that one mostly has costs, unlike sustainability, which has costs and benefits. Security dimension is, of course, the fact that we have a war raging right outside of the EU in Ukraine. Sanctions have been imposed. We can no longer trade with Russia. We don't want to trade with Russia anymore. But there is also the dimension of China feeling increasingly as a threat, and even the US becoming to some extent a threat, which means that a lot of restrictions on exports and imports and investments and so on are being imposed. They may very well be necessary, but they also impose costs for us. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't want to have them, but we have to accept them. Having said that, I wanted to say a few things about US, China, and India, because that's what we have in this panel. When it comes to the US, the way we view things here in Europe is that everything in the US when it comes to trade is basically bad. There is no silver lining to this. The trust has been eroded. We are facing steep tariffs when you trade with the Americans. There is there's no formal agreement, but there is some kind of a deal which will to try to mitigate the effects. But no one really believes the deal will last. And then there is the diverging views on the green transition. Just hearing Donald Trump speaking at the UN last week, it's very different from the discussion that is going on in Europe. And if our businesses have invested heavily in taking part of the green transition, and then suddenly Donald Trump, no, not suddenly, he said it all the time, but Donald Trump saying we're not interested in the green transition, then of course we have a major problem also from a business perspective. Why did the EU, why is the EU still so lame and not hitting back against the US? The primary reason is because of the war in Ukraine. As long as the Americans continue to support Ukraine, which they do actually, despite all the rhetoric from Trump, Europe will probably remain calm and hope for continued American support. Coming to China, I think we have reached a peak China in the sense of trade with China would not increase anymore. It will probably start decreasing. It has started decreasing. China is not trusted. I happen to come from a country where the vast majority of people say they don't trust China at all. But businesses continue trading and they need to trade with China because there's so much China has to offer to us, both as a supplier, all the kind of things we need, and as a major market. Some businesses actually say they fear China less than the US because China is behaving more according to the rule book than the US does. But that's, of course, a matter of perspective. But as I said, quite a number of firms are divesting and reducing the dependence on China as a source of production. And that, when it comes to the issue of jobs, could mean new jobs in India. It could mean new jobs in the Southeast Asia region, but it seems to mostly lead to new jobs in Europe, actually, because most of the firms that are to some extent leaving China, reducing their presence in China, seem to be heading back to their headquarter countries in Europe. But it's still early days. We'll see. I also wanted to say that the green transition in China is very different from what's happening in the US, and that does provide a major opportunity for Europe, but it's also a major threat. And last autumn, 1 year ago, I was very much involved in the issue of whether Europe should or should not impose countervailing measures against the imports of Chinese electrical vehicles. So these vehicles are needed for the green transition in Europe, but they're also supported by unfair state aid in China, which distort the marketplace, and that needs to be addressed. So yeah, it's a lot of on the one hand, but on the other hand, when it comes to China. Then finally, India. India is clearly flying under the radar. Most media is focused on the US, to much less extent China, and to an even less extent India. But to the extent that businesses think about India, they almost only see it as an opportunity. India is not seen as a threat. India has soft power in Europe, unlike the US and China. But it's mild soft power because people don't think about India so much. But we, from our organization, view it as a potential long-term growth area where the peak, unlike with US and China, the peak is very, very, very far away. We have only started our trading relationship with India. And there is one major problem, of course, which won't go away, and that is the fact that India has very close relations with Russia, which is a really, really big problem for us because that stops us from having a, shall we say, more strategic alliance with India, but it doesn't stop us from having a much more fruitful trade relationship. I can come back to the ongoing FTA negotiations with India later if you want to, but at this stage, I also wanted to mention the rest of the world that unlike the US, which is closing its border very much, the EU doesn't pursues the opposite, actually. The EU has a free trade agreement with the Mercosur countries and South America, only to be approved. It concluded an agreement with Indonesia last week, and negotiating with a whole range of other countries, apart from the FTAs it already has in place. The GSP, as Ed mentioned, the preferential system that we have in Europe, will not lock down tomorrow. It will be extended. Some changes here and there, of course, but our tariff-free access import regime towards developing countries will stay in force, and aid for trade programs for developing countries continue. And then two more things. I've spoken about our bilateral relationships with various countries. I also wanted to say that for a few years ago, most of the action when it came to trade policy was actually unilateral issues in Europe. We have imposed a whole range of new legislation in Europe that you mentioned, Sabina. Some of it, most of it's not in force yet, and some of it is being rolled in as we speak. So in India, the focus is very much on the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the so-called climate tariffs. They will not have a major effect on employment, I think. And then you have, but it's still important. And then you have the European Union deforestation regulation, mostly affecting countries with large forests, of course. But it's primarily the supply chain legislation, which is called CSRD and CSDDD, and the Forced Labor Act. What they have in common is that they, in various ways, obliges European firms that have operations, supply chains outside of Europe to police their supply chains in various ways for various kinds of sustainability requirements. And if they fail in doing so, they might be facing heavy fines. We'll see exactly how these laws will be, how they will look once they're in place. Well, then we'll see how they will be actually applied. So we'll be furious until we know much. But they might have big impacts in some supply chains from some countries, very direct impacts. Not saying that it will increase or decrease the number of jobs, but it could clearly affect the quality of the jobs in those sectors. And but it may also be, my final thing is that some of them will, of course, lead to counter reactions because some of this will require firms in countries outside of Europe. It's an extraterritorial legislation. It will require firms outside of Europe to opening up their businesses for scrutiny from officials coming from Brussels, and that will of course be sensitive. So we might have new trade conflicts evolving out of this. Even though I personally think it might be bureaucratic, it might be costly in many ways, but the intention is good one. The intention is to do good, and most of our businesses are behind this if it can be handled in a pragmatic manner, of course. I think I stop there.
Thank you so much, Henrik, for that very, expansive articulation of how Europe is navigating the landscape, to how Europe views China and China's place in the global landscape, to Europe's sort of sustainability provisions and how they might affect trade with India and other global South countries. I wanted to just come back to you before we move on, and next we're going to talk about China. But before that, I just had a quick question for you, and we'll come back with more detailed questions later in the conversation. But really quickly, I'm just wondering about these kinds of sustainability standards. So while these are absolutely critical for, raising standards in the countries that Europe is trading with, I've spent a good part of my career advocating for better provisions in trade agreements and so on. So all in support of good provisions in different kinds of trade instruments that improve working conditions. However, that has to come with some kind of ability and capacity and will on the other end, right? And while these trading mechanisms can create an incentive for will, there isn't always the capacity to deliver on those standards as well. What are you seeing in terms of what the effects of these provisions might be? You kind of said it'll improve quality, maybe not quantity. Can you go into that a little bit? And is there anything that accompanies this in terms of capacity building to actually be able to elevate standards and to meet these higher standards of sustainability, both social and environmental?
Yeah, well, it is complex to design this kind of legislation, because if you go too far, you might end up in a situation where the requirements that we have for other countries to trade with Europe are so high that no one can trade with us. And then we have gained nothing. We've actually lost something instead. And firms around the world will go bankrupt and people will become unemployed because they cannot meet our requirements. So we can only set requirements that are possible actually to implement, and not only for very big businesses, but also for small ones. And once having done that, even if you lower them to a more realistic level, you still need capacity building, as you say, because without capacity building, this won't work. I mean, you need information, of course, but then you need education and you need various other forms of programs in order to make it possible, because we want these imports. We realize that these imports are needed, and in order to have them in an ethical manner, and if you put up these higher requirements, then you need various kinds of assistance. So there are a whole range of programs. The EU has programs, individual member countries like Sweden has programs, and there are also, of course, programs within corporations. For example, if a corporation has business with an LDC, for example, a less developed country, they want to continue those operations, they might invest voluntarily extra money in order to increase compliance with certain regulations so that they can continue trading. So there are a lot of things going on, and even though also in Europe, aid budgets are going down, but to a much lesser extent in the US. But they're not only going down, they're also being redirected. And they are being redirected, at least in Sweden, towards more aid for trade programs in a broad sense. So exactly the kind of things that you're talking about is being funded to a greater extent than before.
Great. Thank you so much, Henrik. So now let's come to China, right? Ed talked about how there's been sort of a climate of dissent in the US for a while, and a lot of this is vis-a-vis the trading relationship with China and China's growing prominence in the global economic landscape. we also heard from Henrik saying, people in Europe just China is not trusted, right? And companies are thinking about divesting from China. Now, there's no question that China is a central player in today's trade order. And there are many concerns over its influence over industries and value chains. So I now wanted to come to Yan. Yan, if you could please bring some of the Chinese perspective and, or from your perspective, help us understand the Chinese perspective. How is China strategically responding to the current landscape and to some of these sort of dynamics that both Ed and Henrik have kind of touched upon? So over to you, Yan. Thank you for joining us. I know you're Pacific Standard Time, so it's 5 a.m. for you, and we're really grateful for you joining us at this hour. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. All right. So I hear the question that you just have. I think I'm going to focus a little bit on, the current trade in China, and then how it impacts for jobs. But then if we wanted to zoom out to talk about the broader trading relationships China has with Europe and other countries, I think we could get to that part. So I'm not going to speak very long because I think I would prefer to have the interactions. So this is a very sort of catching title that basically I took from the Bloomberg, which cited from, I believe, Goldman Sachs's estimate that once the trade war, China and the US came to the full bloom, then China would have up to 20 million people that would suffer, from these kinds of trade interruptions, right? So up to about 3% of the labor force will be negatively exposed to the US-bound exports. And so that is a very significant number, as we know that, US only account for about 14.7% of China's exports. But when it comes to the employmental impact, that's a whole 20 million people's, jobs, right, are at stake. But so far as we know, after 4 rounds of trade negotiations, after all these, Geneva talks, Stockholm talks, London talks, and the most recent in where is it? I cannot keep track anymore, right? Each one of the European cities will become a negotiation place, and I think there's another talk that already in the making. But after all these talks, I think the current reality is that the US keeps a 30% extra tariffs on China, right? That includes a 10% basically baseline that most countries have, and then a 20% fentanyl-related tariff on China. So that's 30% of this round. And then the previous Trump #1 also imposed somewhere between 18-20 effective tariff rates. So right now we're looking at China's tariff rate. Again, the estimate vary, depends on how you count it. But we could just say, right, conservatively, it's at least at the 50% range. And so that is prohibitively high when you think about trade between the two. Well, the good news for China, right, so far is that it has been weathered through the tariff, onslaught quite well. Not only because, as I mentioned earlier, right now the tariff rate is still relatively manageable, and China was able to really diversify its exports to other countries. So what you're seeing in this chart is that, first of all, in the first 8 months of this year, China's exports has grew by 6.7%, right, in the nominal terms. What you're seeing is that the decline of the trade to the United States, which is this light blue bar, it's over offset by its exports to other countries like, ASEAN countries, the Southeast 10 countries, also Europe, Africa, and Latin America. So all these areas have seen an increase in China's exports. So there are some kind of transfer shipments in the data, but still that is a relatively small share. So in other words, a lot of this trade diversion is that China is able to sell their products to a third country, and that products may or may not be retransferred to the United States. So this is where China is standing right now. So trade has been increasing. Its trade surplus has been expanding. So it seems to be weathering through the trade war so far relatively unscratched. But again, because the trade negotiation is still on, as we know, the talk was focused on TikTok deal, and both sides have agreed on some kind of constructive framework in settling that deal. So it remains to be seen, right? What will be the next round of talk and how would that affect tariffs? And we can talk about that. But that said, I think from a broader point of the picture, right? For one is we know that manufacturing jobs has been declining in the world, and the same is happening in China. So China's manufacturing jobs actually peaked in 23 of over 300 million, and now is slightly less than 300 million. This is a little bit outdated. This is 2018, but the trend continued. And I tell you that. Why? Because I think, we also saw in the stats from the Chinese, Data Bureau, that you're seeing the industrial sector share of the jobs has been declining. So the service sector is rising in its place, right? And so that seemed to be, conformed to, many countries' experience where the service sector is rising, whereas the manufacturing sector is declining. And one of the major reasons is because, for one, is the labor cost is actually rising in China, right? Even though many people think that China is a cheap cost production site, but that's no longer really the case. When you see, China's wage growth in the past 2 decades, right, it has rising relatively fast. And this manufacturing unit labor is taking into account the labor productivity, as you know. So that you can see that the wage cost, the wage competitiveness has been eroding. But at the same time, China continues to increase its manufacturing value added, right? Because it keeps adding value to its products, and that is not from intensive labor, but it's from capital and skill. So again, coming back to the reason why China is losing manufacturing jobs despite rising trade, it has a lot to do with technologies. And I think that China sees the robotics industry as one of the strategic emerging industries, and but that has significant job impacts, of course, right? So we know that China 2022 has adopted 268,000 industrial robots, and that is the largest of more than the rest of the world combined. But 77% of the Chinese jobs are faced this kind of vulnerability to automation, according to various studies. So 77%, right, up north of 70%. There's some very prominent cases where the Foxconn, as we know, the subcontractor of Apple, they laid off 400,000. Well, actually not laid off, they just replaced the jobs. Some of the jobs they never set ties to human beings, right? They replaced over 400,000 jobs with robots. And the Zhejiang province, which is the highly export-oriented province, they replaced over 2 million jobs with robots. So, and there are some econometric studies that have shown, right, if you have 1% increase in the robot, one standard deviation increase in robot, that would increase the probability of unemployment by 5 percentage points. Okay, so this is how automation, right, is really the cause of why China may be losing manufacturing jobs fast. And of course, the reason to use robots, partly because of China's aging population, partly also is to try to maintain this kind of competitiveness in the export sector. So I think those two are connected. So I think what I was asked to do is also talk about the government's response. What I would say is the government has been really aware of the situation, right? Not only because the employment is important, but also most importantly, youth unemployment, as we all know, is quite high in China. So college graduates, there are over 12 billion of them are looking for jobs. And so these are really important tasks, right, to create jobs. So I have some just headlines here, which is the Chinese government back in April, in the sort of this uncertainty of the trade war, they have published various employment boosting policies. And then July, just the very recent policy has been rolled out again to stabilize employment. And so the measures that they have, right, for direct job creation or employment support are, again, there are a host of those type of policies, right? One is that they provide basically tax refunds and subsidies and loans to export-oriented businesses, especially the smaller and more vulnerable businesses, right? To allow them to not to pay too much their insurance premium, to provide some specific loans that would stabilize employment. There's also the so-called work relief program. So basically, if you lose a job, right, the government will provide you with some kind of financial aid, right, on top of your unemployment insurance. They also have a lot of policies to support exporters, help them to find new markets or turn their export products into domestic markets, right? Sell on Alibaba, for instance, to standardize the sort of the measures, standardize the criteria, right, in a more streamlined way. They're also spending on skills and vocational trainings, trying to upskill the workers, which I think it is very important, because when you look at how the robotics replace jobs, those are mostly in low and medium skills jobs. Okay, but I think the broader economic strategies are the more interesting ones, because specific job targeting policies are still quite patchwork and still quite I would say not that effective, right? But from the broader perspective, the measures have been taken to trying to boost domestic demand. As we know, the Chinese government has been rolling out all these subsidies for consumption, right? The so-called trade-in program, 300 billion subsidies last year. This year is also budget, but sorry, last year 150 billion. This year is 300 billion yuan subsidies to boost domestic consumption. Also, the continued development of technologies to maintain that competitiveness in export markets, enhanced trade partnership, as I just mentioned about, a lot of the measures have been taken, right? Lower tariff rates on all African countries, 53 of them, and also, trying to streamline the free trade zone negotiations with ASEAN countries, right? Now the FTE 3.1. So there's a lot of measures being taken trying to divert trade to the third markets. And last but not the least, I think this is really what's important, is that China needs to develop its service sector, not only for jobs, but also to boost consumption, right? Because service consumption in China is very low. It's about 50% of the total consumption, which is much lower than other countries, 70% and above. So there's a lot of room for service sectors to expand, and that's a sector also holds a lot of the potential to create jobs. So right now, the measures, the most important ones, the most recent ones, are providing subsidies on interests on the loans that consumers take out to finance their service consumption, but also for service providers when they want to expand their production services, they also get subsidies on the loans. So those are some of the measures at the broader level, right? Trying to stimulate domestic demand and create jobs that are more, domestic oriented. Okay, so I'm sorry again for being late, and so I'm trying to catch up on some time, and that's all I have for now, but happy to take questions and have discussions with panelists.
Great,
Thank you
so much, Han. I'll just add an announcement that, if any of the participants would like to send their questions in via the chat, we'd be happy to take them. But now I would like to turn to Ranja, our final panelist for this evening. So Ranja, we've heard about the strategic shifts in the US and Europe, China, how China is kind of undertaking, how China is not sort of affected to the extent that the outside world is kind of talking about in media and so on, and also the internal measures, they're sort of turning inward to cope with some of the social pressures of the trade shocks, including various kinds of consumption subsidies, youth employment programs, and so on, as we just heard from Jan. But I'm curious about how, if you could sort of broaden this perspective now from US, Europe, and China to look at the developing world more broadly and sort of shed light on how these disruptions are translating into very concrete risks and pressures, particularly vis-a-vis employment for the Global South. What do you see as the most critical areas in current trade policy making for developing countries that will shape employment outcomes in particular? And then if you'd like to, because you also look at India, if you wanted to specifically cite examples in the context of India, we'd welcome those as well. Over to you, Ranja.
Thanks a lot, Sabina. Thanks for organizing this and the invitation. Yeah, Third World Network, my organization, we work with a lot of developing countries and LDCs, trying to support them in a lot of global policy negotiations, climate trade and intellectual property rights, health, many other areas. I am, of course, from India, and I will kind of use maybe Indian example because everybody also wants to know about India, because India has been hit with this 50%, 25% plus 25% for Russia buying Russian oil. So a lot of my analysis is premised on India, but frankly, it really extends, because I will talk about some of these, what's been happening in trade policy for some time, but of course, now kind of culminating in the current Trump administration's position. So let me say, of course, US, I mean, starting with the US, there's a lot of discussion on tariff, if tariff. I keep joking that, even a few months back when we spoke to a lay audience, we never would use the word tariff because nobody would follow. You would say border taxes or even import duties, but not tariffs. But now, thanks to President Trump, maybe for the wrong reasons, everybody knows what tariffs are. So there's a lot of focus on tariff. And of course, tariffs directly hit the goods sector, right? Agriculture sector and manufactured products, of course. And India, for one, is 20 to 25% of India's exports is to the merchandise export is to the US. So it has some exposure for sure. But also we are seeing that, the global South countries are very dependent on US markets. So what I want to do today quickly, and I know we are actually probably running out of time, I want to focus on the traditional sectors like agriculture, dairy, fisheries, which is very important in India for sure. And you've heard that how India-US trade talks actually collapsed because India simply, it's too politically sensitive, and India would not consider opening up the agriculture sector, dairy sector, for zero duty entry of US exports. And agriculture, it is true for many developing countries. So I want to talk a bit about this sector, but then I want to kind of draw lessons that, we are focusing a lot on tariffs. And of course, tariffs have a huge impact, but the US trade deals, and not only the US trade deals, even the WTO agreements increasingly, and the free trade agreements have a lot of non-tariff issues. And actually the Trump deals now that Trump is kind of negotiating or concluding with many of these countries have a lot of issues like non-tariff issues, for example, intellectual property rights, government procurement, e-commerce, like digital economy, and subsidy standards, and many other regulatory issues, actually. These would actually make a deep impact on policy space of global South countries. I think that's, for me, a very, very important point to remember here. And some of the tariffs can be rolled back. I think many of the countries are hoping that once maybe, the US current government changes, they could simply roll back the tariffs and move into the pre-Trump era. But probably, firstly, that does not seem realistic. And secondly, where you've made major policy changes, in response to US demands, then those would be very difficult to roll back. And I will come back to, I think, a bit of the digital issues with respect to that. But let me first maybe talk about agriculture, dairy, and fisheries. For LDCs, agriculture is more than 50% of LDC exports, 10 to 20% of developing country exports. These are like really sensitive sector, agriculture, dairy especially. And also we have a lot of small holders. 70 to 95% of our farmers are actually small holders, cultivating less than 2 hectares. These sectors are gender sensitive. This is where also women can, because with very little capital, they do not have access to land, but at least they can work as workers. They don't need so much financial capital and so on. So this is kind of mainstay also for women. But now, one interesting thing about tariffs is, when the WTO during the Uruguay round, actually, like everybody's saying, why do developing countries, or India, of course, but many other countries, they have higher tariffs? And in a way, I think at least at the beginning, I heard many experts also say, yes, US does have very low tariffs and developing countries have very high tariffs. But the Uruguay round bargain was that developing countries would keep tariffs because that was their main protective tool. Developed countries, many of whom already had low tariff, they could give very high subsidies. They had, standard barriers. They had high technical standards and food standards, for example, and technical barriers like certification and, those kind of processes. And developing countries, in fact, they kind of already made concessions because of the TRIPS agreement, the TRIMS agreement, even in GATS, which were not in their interest. For example, the TRIPS agreement, they were not the owners of intellectual property, really. They were not generating the knowledge and the research, and they didn't have the patents. But they agreed to those agreements, and this was kind of like the understanding. So that's why, and LDCs were allowed zero tariff access into many of the developed country markets because, again, they had made, concessions in other areas. But now, and already in agriculture, you would see that, we know from the history of the WTO, huge debates about Western subsidies and, even green box, so-called non-trade distorting agricultural subsidies in the West there's been a lot of research that it has affected livelihoods of small farmers across global South countries. For example, I think there's this great study of European subsidized rice entering this Cordillera region in the Philippines, and where women rice farmers' livelihoods were really impacted. So we already have that history where we actually, developing countries have not been, except for some, of course, and some products in some countries. It's not that they did not benefit as much as they thought they would. And they are also reducing tariffs under the free trade agreements, right? But here, India, in fact, has had a very more cautious approach on agriculture, dairy. It has not so far. I mean, I think the UK, its last FTA, in UK, India has still opened up some of these sectors, but really in its past FTAs, India hasn't opened so much. It has been very cautious. But now we see US tariffs 20% to 50%, 15% on EU, Japan, and 10% only on a few countries. Most Southeast Asian countries face 20% and so on. And US, of course, has major interest in agriculture, dairy, meat, poultry, in GM products, in ethanol, and also fisheries, right? So, so we do expect major, I mean, in case India agreed, and many countries are opening up, I mean, even LDCs, for example, there was this leaked report from Bangladesh on the Bangladesh-US deal and the demands that US has made. So, of course, there are tariff-related demands, and that's going to cause direct impact on employment, on farmers and agricultural workers, livelihoods for sure. But the interesting thing, again, I keep going back to this non-tariff issue because the US, the National Trade Estimates report, which kind of, I think, puts together the demand of US businesses from other countries. It's a list of what they see as trade barriers in other countries. And there in the field of agriculture, this report mentions not only tariffs, but subsidies in many countries. And then, SPS measures in other countries, whereas US's own SPS measures and technical barriers are very high, especially compared to global South countries. And then, certification and other measures they are talking about. So, for example, the US has, in terms of standard barriers, for example, US actually has 3,002 and 300 food SPS measures, and EU has 952. Compared to that, Bangladesh has 0. LDCs together have only 597 measures. India has 272 measures. So frankly, there's no comparison, but we are still seeing the US lists out many of these, and they are also asking many countries. We know they've made such demands, I think, to Bangladesh, but many other countries to join UPO of 1991, which is a seed companies treaty, which actually makes it very difficult for farmers to preserve, save, exchange, and reuse seeds. So the US is actually, this is also coming in the FTAs. It's not the US is the first country to demand this, but it has been coming in many FTAs, including EU FTAs. But I think this is definitely being pushed by the US administration. So we are very worried that, given that developing countries and even LDCs are not spared, so they will have to cut not only their tariffs, but they are being asked sometimes to recognize US standards. They are being asked to allow US products in, just recognizing US certificates. If they have their own processes, they should just, they should do away with those. And then it's also a double whammy because, the US raises its tariffs, other countries lower theirs. The US keeps its standards and technical barriers, other countries do away with theirs. So this I see to be very, very worrying because it's just, if you pack everything together, everything on top of each other, tariff and all these non-tariff measures, and then US gets a lot of protection, but other countries kind of have to lower theirs. Together, it's going to definitely impact all our countries. And, like Indian fisheries sector, fisheries, it's quite a major export to the US for us, and it's already being impacted. And a lot of the threat, the higher cost is being transferred to very small fish producers because, because those, you can understand that in this trading supply chain, those who are not organized, those who do not have power, they actually will be always at the receiving end. So we are already seeing impacts in the fisheries sector on fish workers, but also if India opens up agriculture, dairy, but even other countries, we are expecting, for example, African countries, Madagascar will face challenge in vanilla. And then many, processed agri exports that many developing countries have. We do expect some lot of challenge there. Let me just quickly touch on the digital issue because we are expecting the US, from what we can hear and what is there in the NTE report, we are seeing that US will make some demands in the area of digital trade and e-commerce. And then also, of course, as I said, opening up government procurement market, major demands to go TRIPS plus in the area of intellectual property rights and so on. So digital, we know and we heard that, of course, AI and automation is replacing workers anyway, and then in highly skilled sectors, maybe there is growth of jobs at high income, but we expect, for example, our ordinary in the mom and pop stores, they were already facing challenge in our countries, for example, from formal retail and then foreign retail companies, and now from Amazon and so on. And that's already, Amazon, etc., they more or less have entry into most countries. We've seen a massive challenge to unskilled or medium skilled, lower skilled workers, and in many of these sectors. But I just wanted to quickly touch upon two issues. One is, the kind of provisions that are now coming in the trade agreements and which we expect US also to make such demands. One is the free flow of data. Now, this is, of course, believed to be, and there's a lot of research which does say that, free flow of data will be very good, in particular for MSMEs and small startups across the world. They can get the data and they can benefit. But we have seen the politics of it is often it's not as free, like free trade. Free trade is frankly never as free as it sounds. And this is also not that free. It's often very difficult. It makes it, it's often the data goes to global north countries and it gets kind of developed there into goods and services and sold back to global south countries. Whereas the data, even public government data, is kind of on demand. So the demand from these trade agreements, and I think from the US, will be that there should be free flow of data, which is, I think, a challenge for our own digital industrialization policy. This will going to have massive impact on our startups, on our MSMEs, on our workers. If we can design global south countries, our digital industrial policy in a way that suits, our skills, our workers, and helps our startups, then I think that would give them a lot of boost. It could create a lot of jobs. And I think that is really making many policymakers in India, but I know in many other developing countries worried. The free flow of data, how free should this data be? And the other issue that I continuously think, when we talk about workers, it's not about job loss, job gain. It's the nature of work. And it's also, there are these host of provisions in these trade deals that actually impact workers in an indirect way. For example, this Trump yesterday, he announced that he will put 100% tariff on movies which are made abroad. But actually on this concept called e-transmissions, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. So when you download a movie or a game or a book, so because it's digital at the moment, there's no tax on it. So there is this deal in the WTO renewed every 2 years that then countries do not impose a tax. And of course, because digital corporations are based in developed countries, they gain more. Developing countries actually lose a lot of revenue, so potential revenue. There's an UNCTAD study that showed that, for example, India, China, developing countries, LDCs, they've lost a lot of potential tariff revenue. And this kind of revenue is actually very important for workers, because that tariff revenue can be spent on social sector, on education, on training, on skills, on health of workers, and so on. So I think these indirect channels could actually be of great importance and interest to protect workers' rights and interests. So with that, let me end. I had some thoughts about manufacturing and all, but I think I'm sure I have exceeded my time already.
That's all right. Thank you so much, Ranja, for such a detailed, both historical, bringing us up to today's moment from the Uruguay round all the way to today, to looking at how a range of non-tariff barriers and other practices kind of affect the ability of the global South to effectively engage in trade, and how it affects their employment and their economies. That was really insightful, and thank you for the very wide ranging set of issues that you touched upon. I wanted to, Henrik, maybe come back to you. And so I'm going to start taking questions now from the chat, and also kind of add my own to that. So Henrik, if I could come to you, one of the questions that we have in the chat is, about are European businesses benefiting from tariffs in the US regarding more and cheaper imports from countries of the global South? So that's one question that I'll pose to you from one of our listeners. But I'm going to add another question, which is, I thought it was really interesting that you said that most businesses and companies that are moving out of China are not relocating to other countries in the global South, but are actually moving back to Europe, to the extent that there is already evidence of this. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because, a lot of the global South labor surplus countries have in the past used that to their advantage in terms of promoting, production and manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing of different kinds, and use that as a significant part of their development strategies. If those pathways are no longer available, and there is, in fact, this kind of reshoring going on, is that an issue of alarm? Is that something that we should be looking out for more and more? So I was wondering if you could just take a few minutes, maybe 3 to 4 minutes, to kind of elaborate on both of these questions. Over to you, Henrik.
Okay, thank you. So as for the first question, it's interesting because it's the first time it's been posed like that, but it is very, very relevant, because the issue is being discussed in Europe for sure, but it's mostly being posed in another way, basically by saying that, and it's very much again having to do with China. The rest of the world seems to be forgotten in the European debate sometimes, because the debate is like this: if China cannot sell all the things they want to the United States, then they will sell it all to us, and we will be forced to buy all those cheap goods that we don't really want to buy, but we'll have to buy them anyway, and that'll be very bad for us. That's how the debate sounds. But there are a number of problems with that. One of them is that it's not only China, it's the entire global South. If you say it's not even only the entire global South, it's actually every single country that faces a tariff barrier in the US might look for other markets, and they might look for us. And if that's then a good or a bad thing, it depends. But as a representative of an organization that actually likes imports, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It might be a very good thing. But it depends. I mean, if some of these goods that are coming into our market is here due to state aid in their home country, I'm mostly thinking about China, but it could be from other countries as well, then it's not good. So it's simply we'll have to wait and see. And I'm not sure about to what extent it's actually happening yet. Everyone seems to agree that it will happen, but exactly when and for what products and how big will the price pressure be when they start selling discounted goods to us, we'll simply have to wait and see. As for the second question, well, I read a report this morning from the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, which is a business lobby for all the big European firms that are active in China. And they compile a lot of statistics based on surveys with their members. And they say that most of the firms that are in Europe, most European firms that are in China are staying in China. Almost no one is leaving, but also almost no one is expanding. So they're staying in China for the sake of being in China and selling to the Chinese market. But they're moving some operations out and they're cutting some suppliers out when it comes to trading with the rest of the world. And then they say in their report that most of those activities are going back to Europe. But there are other reports showing having different stories. And a main winner could be Vietnam, a country that is trying to send out a strong message is Indonesia, because I participated in a meeting a few months ago with the Indonesian chief negotiator. That was before this agreement was concluded last week. It was the EU chief negotiator with Indonesia, and I asked him, what do the Indonesians actually want from this agreement? And he said basically they want a big quality mark. They want a big quality mark of their entire country saying open for business, and they want to use that to attract European investments. That's what they want. Let's see if they succeed, because if they succeed, and if they in Vietnam, for example, could be seen as more reliable than China, then much European investments will go there and jobs will be created. And then, of course, there is India. And we have the FTA negotiations with India, but they are slow, and we don't know if we'll have an agreement, and we don't know if we'll have a good agreement, so it's too early to tell. But clearly, there are lots of opportunities for various countries in the global south to attract European investments out of China. But the jury is still out whether that will work or not and who will benefit.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Henrik. Jan, I wanted to come to you quickly because I have also received a question specifically for you, which is more about about your view on state aid in China and to what extent China's competitiveness is based on such aid. So if you could maybe comment a little bit on that, that would be great. Jan, over to you.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, so I think, this focus on the state subsidies or aid, it's really, I think it's sort of the focus on the tree, but miss the whole forest, right? So if you think about the EV sector, for example, the CSIS and many others have done the research and they crunched the number and say, China is subsidizing so much in the EV industry. But the matter of fact is that the subsidy is really just a very small part of the entire industry strategy or the entire, strategic support of the EV industry. When you think about the government's role, it's way beyond providing subsidies. What it has done is it helped to, secure all these very important rare earth minerals, critical minerals that go into the production of these cars. It helped to, support public investments in infrastructure. So building all these publicly charging stations that allow, fast adoption of these cars. Also, investments in R&Ds and so much more. Not to mention at the local government level, they're not just helping to provide some sort of subsidies and then uses, of course, but they actually help to strategize the entire supply chain and help to recruit, talents, but also relevant suppliers from all over the country. So I think government's role is very pivotal in China's newly, emerging industries like EV, like solar panels, and so on and so forth. Subsidy is really a very small part of that. And if you look at, for example, different data on, say, subsidies per car or subsidies per product, it's very minuscule. So in other words, even at the absolute level, you can see that subsidy is relatively high, but they typically happen at the early stage of those industries. They do get rolled out gradually over time. which I think, again, this is a smart way of using industry policies, because I think, a lot of debates is about, once you have the protection, you can never remove it. But in China, that didn't seem to be a problem. So they have been quite successful in implementing these kinds of very strategic industry policies, and again, go beyond, way beyond subsidies. So that's what I would say. And again, I think that's important for other countries if they wanted to, right, to adopt certain policies. It's not really the amount of subsidies that matters. It's really the whole, strategic vision, but also support from all different aspects.
Great, thank you, Yan. And that's interesting, Ranja. I'd like to just come back to you for a couple of minutes. The points that Yan just raised about the different kinds of state support that go beyond subsidies in order to nurture and foster innovation and different sectors and build trade capacity. I was wondering what you think is the most effective strategy for India to follow in the current environment, and what are the sort of strategic objectives, and how should the state be looking at the current landscape, and what are the sort of top priorities in terms of withstanding the current tumult of the current moment, but also in terms of building the capacity within India of businesses, small businesses, whether it's manufacturing, services. You brought up digital. How should we be navigating this landscape?
Yeah, that's a tough one for sure. But also I see a question that on automation, exactly kind of like this in the context of, I think, the digital sector, of what kind of policy combination to follow. And yes, I guess it would be a combination of definitely a very strong domestic policy. And I would say, we've seen that subsidies is not always a bad word. It should be linked to your stage of development. When you are trying to develop a sector, and earlier, I think in the chat, Sabina, there was also a question of whether tariffs are good. Should we actually have tariffs, because then you do not trade so much? I wouldn't agree fully with that, because there are countries which cannot produce everything they need. We do need international trade, but on fair terms. And I would say for Global South, without compromising their policy space for development. And it has to recognize that, a country, especially a developing country's trade policy will change based on its stage of development. So yes, when you were talking about what kind of policy combination should India, say, go for, or other Global South countries, I think as far as trade policy is concerned, I think we've always said policy space, policy space, policy space. You need to protect one industry, one sector today. Tomorrow you will need to protect. And developed countries, US has used something like, I think, 50% industrial tariff when they grew. So, tariff, I would say tariff, subsidies, and other, tools, technology, and so on, the government has to deploy. But for very poor countries, it's a tough choice, because it's finance and technology. These, especially, and when Henrik was also talking about the sustainability issue, that for Global South countries, now they have the additional challenge of meeting sustainability standards. And it's a challenge even for developed country businesses, as Henrik, correctly pointed out. And I was in the WTO Public Forum this month, and there was a panel by the Canadian, I think, beef and the cattle and dairy farmers groups or something, and they themselves were grappling with sustainability standards. And then it's a major challenge, of course, in developing countries. The government has to firstly design its trade policy, keeping the policy flexibility. It should be able to design its trade policy based on its stage of development, and to be able to change it when it's moving up the development pathway. And of course, definitely important sectoral policies. Global South has talked about industrial policy for so long, that they wanted more policy space to design their individual industrial policy. And now in the time of automation, that's like really critical, that they should be able to design their digital industrialization policy. Now industrial policy is back in vogue, and we know that Global North countries are now talking about it. But, you know, the demands will not always be the same. What would work for global North countries will not maybe work for global South countries. And I think for global South countries as a group, they have to articulate like what their industrial policy demands are, and then kind of, to make the case for that. And also, of course, as I said, like sectoral policies. India has very successfully had a pharma policy and automobile sector policy, but it kind of almost didn't have other manufacturing sector policies. And we can see that, in how the manufacturing sector, in its weaknesses and its growth path. But some of the way many developing countries designed their industrial policy, especially sector-specific industrial policies, are now all being challenged in a way by the US trade policy stance. They have to undo everything, So yeah. I think how do they marry domestic policies and finance and technology, I think will be key parts of a trade and a domestic policy combination.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Ranja. Ed, I'd like to come back to you as the final word on the entire conversation that we've just had. But more pointedly, there was an interesting question that was raised by Gautam Khandelwal, and it was, could tariffs actually be good for the world? It could help rebalance the world, reduce shipping of goods, which would be environmentally friendly. And then goes on to talk about, while there would be uncertainties and potentially harmful effects for some countries, is this overall restructuring a good thing? And I wanted to come back to you to kind of broaden that question out a little bit and really bring us home with sort of, what does this mean for the global trading regime, and particularly the multilateral system, the WTO, the multilateral system, and and what in your view is the forecast for the if you had a crystal ball, Ed, what do the next few years hold in terms of the global trading regime and what it looks like? You have the final word, Ed. Over to you. I know those are huge questions, but
yeah,
I know
those are
long enough to know
nice,
that.
easy questions. I guess I would say I have been a advocate of the WTO and the global trading system. That basically rests on insights drawn from the Second World War, in which U.S. government, the Indian government at the time, newly independent, European governments, Chinese government just before the revolution, felt like one of the big lessons of the Depression was that countries trying to save themselves at other expense had made everything worse, that had encouraged violent nationalism and helped kind of open the way to the war, and a more integrated world in which countries saw one another as customers and as suppliers would be more prosperous and probably more peaceful on balance than not. I think that was correct. And I look to European Union, to Australia, to Canada, as countries that are continuing to defend this system. I think it has been a very successful developmental approach. If you look, for example, at poverty rate in India, in 1987, it was 52%. Now it is 5%. India is a far more diversified economy. In terms of its digital flows, it is the superpower of exporting digital services to the world. If we begin to adopt a kind of unlimited policy space in which the US and the Trump administration are taxing digital trade, other countries are doing the same, we're having tariffs, countries will not be, there'll be lots of roads that are closing to development. There'll be lots of new kind of conflicts and arguments over economics and fewer common interests. And I think that's sort of a more dangerous world. In terms of shipping and environmental standards, is a complex question. And when you're thinking of climate change and protection of the oceans and global systems as very important to the future of the world in general, and to animals and plants and to human beings, it's not clear that less shipping will make the world better. It will mean more duplication. I mean, every country has its own steel industry. That means the Indian, the South African, the Brazilian steel industries are extremely climate emissions intensive. Chinese one, not so much. European one, not so much. U.S. relatively very clean. In that sense, more shipping and more trade would be environmentally friendly, I think. I would also say, obviously, a lot of governments, and especially ours, have kind of lost interest or faith in this set of principles. And we're involved in an experiment in which we see what the alternative is like. I don't think it has been good choices on the part of the administration. I can see already in the data what they expected to happen from tariffs within the US is not what's actually happening. And I don't expect this really to improve very much. There will definitely be some industries that benefit, but others will be surprisingly hurt. Really big one, automotive industry. I've had a couple of conversations with companies. They think with the Trump administration's 15% tariff on imported cars, 25% tariff on imported parts, 50% tariffs on metals, it's now probably cheaper to buy a car from Europe or Asia than it is to make one in the United States. These things are going to show up as surprises and pretty unwelcome ones. So I have to say that I am not optimistic about these next few years. Sometimes you draw lessons from the past that are good or they're not good. Sometimes you learn by experience, and I'm afraid we're in the mode of learning by experience right now. And there's going to be some kind of painful lessons that we draw from it 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead. And I hope the damage to the economy, but more fundamentally to a sense of mutual security and common interests among countries, is not irreparable as it became in 100 years ago.
Well, with that, Ed, I'm reluctant to leave us on such a pessimistic note. So maybe I'm going to ask you to give us, what needs to happen. What are the 1 or 2 things that need to happen that could actually help bring some sanity to this crazy landscape right now? What should countries be thinking about? What kinds of alliances might help assuage some of the potentially irreparable damage that you just referred to?
Well, I think America's traditional allies, European Union countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, are handling this quite well. They're not panicking or lashing out, and are trying to mitigate harms, find common interests where possible, and as Henrik was saying, in the context of an actual war of territorial aggression in Europe, remain focused on the really core things and common interests that have helped in the past to keep the world together. Within the United States, a lot of this is on Congress and the American public. They are watching with a lot of interest, and so far with a lot of disapproval what the administration has been doing. It has been quite, I think, telling that the administration has not gone to Congress and asked them to pass a tariff law. I assume that's because Congress would reject it. That they look at this and they see a lot more harm than good, both to the domestic economy, to some extent to the global economy, and to strategic interests. So, I think there's a high probability that the U.S. will work through this over the next year or two, and will be on a more healthy course, in the next presidential term. So, there's a degree to, there's definitely a constituency that the Trump administration speaks for, and in a way, it parallels some of the ideas that Ranja's mentioned about autonomy and policy space, and that is really what they're thinking about in a way. And if public is going to judge in these next few years whether it's worked or not, and whether we want to stay on this path. And the path is not set down in asphalt and concrete. It's sort of in very fragile set of executive orders and decrees that some of them are very likely illegal, and none of them are set down in law. So there is definitely scope in the U.S. to rethink and look at this and draw some lessons from it. And there are, a lot of countries that are wealthy, successful, powerful, who are, trying to keep the world stable. And I mean, I applaud to them. So, there's no reason to be very optimistic about the next year or two, but there's no reason to be terribly pessimistic about the next 5 or 10.
That's perfect, Ed. I'd much rather end on a note of hope that inspires action. But Ed, Henrik, Ranja, Jan, thank you so much for what I think was an incredibly rich conversation. And an hour and a half is way too short. And so hopefully we'll have you all back on to go even deeper into these issues. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules and for sharing such deep and insightful, comments with us. We really appreciate your input. And thanks to all of our participants that have stayed with us this whole time, and thank you for the rich questions. So with that, I will sign off and look forward to seeing you all at the next Just Jobs Network webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It was great to listen to all of you.
Thank you.